Ever seen a calm person lose it? What happened? Story 1. I used to see this woman in my building every day. We were friendly, always checking in on each other's lives, and even had lunch together a few times over the years. She was much older than me, and I always enjoyed our conversations. One day, we were riding the elevator, and she told me she was saying goodbye. I expressed my sorrow and asked why she was leaving. She mentioned she was retiring that day. Curious, I asked if her office was throwing her a party or if she had celebrated. Her face suddenly contorted with rage. Clenching her teeth, she told me she hadn't informed anyone in her office, including her bosses. She only told the HR person the previous week. This was her last day, and she was never returning to see or talk to anyone in her office again. I realized then how much rage she had bottled up, ready to explode at any moment. It must have been a stressful job. Story 2. My aunt was always super calm, always joking, and in a good mood. In my 15 years, I had never seen her angry or heard her cuss. Until Christmas 1999. Some backstory, my mom had 2 younger brothers. One, whom we called Jerk Uncle, was a complete dong, and the other, Good Uncle, was a pretty average guy who got along with everyone. My grandma enabled my Jerk Uncle, and despite my grandpa's best efforts, he just became more of a jerk. In the summer of '99, Jerk Uncle and my now ex-aunt were separated, with a divorce pending. She, still being nice to her nieces and nephews, called my grandma and asked if she could drop off our Christmas gifts. My grandma said that was fine. When she showed up, my Jerk Uncle was pissed. My grandma told all of us kids, including Jerk Uncle's daughter, to stay in the family room. My mom came in and said that Jerk Uncle had tried to punch his wife in the face, and my good uncle had pulled him back, causing them both to fall through the neighbor's split rail fence. That's when my always super calm aunt stood up and said, "I freaking had it with his wife beating BS. I'm calling the freaking cops. I've had it with this psycho jerk." I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. My grandma was in a panic because she had always enabled Jerk Uncle, and him going to jail for domestic violence would likely cost him his job as a fire chief. Jerk Uncle took off, and shortly after, we all left. Christmas ended a bit early that year. To this day, I've yet to hear my aunt cuss again, and only ever seen her get upset about something once more, and it was again about Jerk Uncle. Story 3. We refer to it now as the Jerry Springer Christmas, but at the time, it was anything but amusing. I was around 7 years old. One of my aunts harbored a deep-seated hatred for her sister-in-law, and it all boiled over that Christmas. She started screaming at her, and soon enough, shoving ensued. Husbands got involved, and the whole scene devolved into chaos. My mom, always the peacemaker, tried to mediate and calm everyone down, but her efforts were futile. She decided to check on us kids and found my cousin and me huddled together, sobbing in fear. The next thing I knew, my mom's scary mom voice boomed over the pandemonium. "Listen here, you motherfruckers," she yelled. "My kid is in there crying on Christmas because her family can't keep their crap together for one day a year. You're going to march your butts into that room, single file, and apologize to each kid individually. Then you're going to shut the hell up until I get them out of here. We're going to go look at the lights, and this family better be the picture of goddamn Christmas joy by the time we get back." My mom rarely cussed in front of me and only ever used goddamn when things were really bad. That side of the family didn't celebrate Christmas together for a few years after that. But every time I think of that story, I'm filled with pride for my mama bear. Hell yeah. Story 4. I worked as a line cook at a busy restaurant and became good friends with the head chef, Michael. He was a chill, easygoing guy who made cooking fun. Michael taught me most of what I know about the culinary arts, and I owe much of my success to him. I'd never seen him get angry until one particularly busy night. We were slammed, and one of the servers said something that really ticked him off. I didn't catch what it was, but suddenly, Michael sent a deep fryer basket flying across the kitchen at Mach speed. It nearly missed the dish kid and shattered a light bulb. Michael stormed off, took a 5-minute smoke break, and then came back as if nothing had happened. He apologized the next day, and we never spoke of it again. The restaurant industry is a stressful place, but it takes a big man to apologize and move on. I respect Michael immensely for that. Story 5. In my late teens, I was financially irresponsible and borrowed money from my grandparents to move out of my mom's house. We made a plan for me to repay it in installments, and I only missed 2 payments. Each time, I called my granddad to inform him, and he was cool about it. One day, I got a call from him, and he was livid. He screamed at me on the phone, and I could hear my grandmother crying in the background. He was the angriest I had ever heard anyone, and I was terrified. He demanded to know why I hadn't made the payment that month, but I was sure I had. It turned out I had accidentally set the automated payment to be drawn from the wrong account, and it hadn't gone through. It was an honest mistake, and I explained this to him. I transferred the money immediately, and he instantly calmed down. Later, I found out he had become an alcoholic after quitting smoking, and he would often talk to my grandmother like that when no one was around. That story made me sad. Consistent outbursts towards a long-term partner felt wrong. Story 6. I had a friend named Thomas who was in his 60s, a functioning alcoholic, yet the most calm and composed man I'd ever known. He carried himself with a sort of meticulous precision that was both admirable and slightly intimidating. Thomas never raised his voice or swore, believing that if you did, you'd have nowhere to go when you genuinely got angry. It was a philosophy he lived by, and in the 3 years I worked with him, I never saw him lose his temper or use vulgar language. One week, Thomas was shafted on his pay. The manager promised it would be resolved by Friday, but when Friday rolled around, nothing had changed. I saw Thomas approach the manager in the open office, his usually calm demeanor intact. But then, in a voice louder than I'd ever heard from him, he declared, "Where the freck is my money? You promised this would be resolved." The entire office went silent. The look of dread on the manager's face was haunting. By the end of the day, the money was in Thomas's account. That was the first and only time I saw him lose his composure. It was startling, but it got results. Story 7. It takes a lot to make my mom yell. On the rare occasion she did, it felt like she had real self-control. Like she yelled on purpose because there was a reason to yell. Like she needed to be that loud for us to hear her, or to teach one of the kids never to run into traffic again, that kind of stuff. But one morning, when we were teenagers, my brother was being really difficult. My very sweet, soft-spoken mother yelled, "God damn it, Sean," and threw a butter knife down so hard it stuck, quivering in the oak hardwood floor against the grain. I can still hear the noise it made. We were all very well behaved for the rest of the day. I eventually asked my mom why she did that. Her explanation was that she felt too angry to hold a knife, even a butter knife, and was trying to get it out of her hand before she did something stupid. I had no idea how to sound like a woman yelling, specifically a mother yelling, so I just moved away from the mic and gave it my all. Hope it was acceptable. This is super fair. I feel that I've never had a moment like that before in my life, but I could see if I got really upset and I was holding a knife, I would try to remove the knife from my grasp. Because when you're really mad, you're not thinking straight, but you're thinking enough to be able to disarm yourself, you know? Story 8. One of my high school teachers, Mr. Thompson, was the epitome of calm. He never yelled or reprimanded us harshly. Instead, he would laugh, smile, and patiently wait for us to settle down before continuing his lessons. His calm demeanor made the classroom a relaxed place to learn. However, one day, we were particularly rowdy. No matter how long he waited, we wouldn't calm down. I could see his frustration building. Suddenly, he bellowed, "Shut up!" The entire class was shocked into silence. Mr. Thompson never had to raise his voice again. His single outburst left a lasting impression on all of us. Story 9. My dad is the most mild-mannered person I've ever met. He's composed and level-headed in a way that seems almost superhuman. I once saw him trip in our garage and land in a bucket of nails and screws, realizing he had one lodged in his kneecap. He just looked over at me and said, "Don't tell your mom, she'll overreact," while he grabbed a pair of pliers and yanked out the screw himself. But when it came to my special needs brother, my dad had a side that could scare a Navy SEAL. When I was 8, my parents decided to take my brother and me to our favorite Mexican restaurant. This was a big deal because my brother had recently been diagnosed with a degenerative physical health issue, which was racking up huge medical debts, and my dad had lost his job after getting laid off. Despite the stress, my parents managed to make this dinner feel lighthearted, and we had a memorable night full of laughter and funny stories. When we left the restaurant, we found a car parked next to us, not in a parking spot, but in the yellow-striped area next to our van. Normally, this might not be an issue, but my brother is in a wheelchair, and we had a heavy metal ramp to load him in and out of the van. The parking lot was busy, and my parents didn't feel comfortable backing into the street to load my brother. My dad went into the restaurant to see if the manager could find the owner of the car and ask them to move. When my dad emerged from the restaurant, I saw a look on his face I'd never seen before. It was one of focus, determination, and rage. He looked at my mom and told her to get in the car. She complied with a hesitant, okay. Sensing that something was about to happen, he turned to me and said, "Watch this." He unfolded the ramp and slammed it onto the roof of the car next to us. He then explained that the manager had told him, "I'm not responsible for what happens in the parking lot. Why don't you just figure something out?" So he did. A minute later, the manager came out yelling, "What are you doing? You can't do that." At this point, my dad lost it. He picked up my brother, wheelchair and all, and sat him on the hood of the car while yelling at the manager. Then he jumped onto the hood, lifted my brother onto the roof, and calmly rolled him across the ramp and into our van. He told me to get in, and then, as if nothing had happened, told the manager, "I figured something out." Since that day, I've never seen my dad get anywhere close to that level of anger again. We laugh about the story now, and my dad always says he overreacted, but I think he reacted just fine. Story 10. I was about 10 years old, hanging out at my friend Jake's house. His dad, Mr. Williams, was the chillest and nicest guy around, always wearing a smile. That day, Mrs. Williams, equally as kind, was across the street chatting with our neighbor. This neighbor was notorious for his lack of common courtesy, blasting loud music, parking his beat-up boat in front of other people's houses, and scattering cars across his lawn. Suddenly, the neighbor started screaming at Mrs. Williams. Jake and I rushed outside, just in time to hear the neighbor call her a derogatory name. Mr. Williams, who had always been the epitome of calm, snapped. He ran across the street, fists clenched, and decked the neighbor, crouching over him, shouting warnings and threats. It took a while for Mrs. Williams to calm him down. None of us had ever seen Mr. Williams react like that. Maybe not even him. To this day, I still think back to that moment. There was something pure and primal about his anger, defending someone he deeply cared about. It wasn't just an outburst. It was a display of love and loyalty in its rawest form. Story 11. I've been in the U.S. Coast Guard for a few years now, and along the way, I met a really calm guy named Joe. Joe had a wife and 2 daughters. He was soft-spoken, yet authoritative when needed, always nice to others, and a hard worker. Then there was another worker named Jill. Jill was a power-tripping, annoying, loud, and disrespectful person to anyone lower ranking than her. She always talked about her definitely fake sea stories and was what we called a blue falcon. One day, Joe and his crew were out on a rescue mission for over 6 hours throughout the whole night. They got back to the station around 2 or 3 a.m., exhausted, and collapsed on the couches in the lounge, which was connected to the conference and training room divided by a folding partition. In the morning, there was a note on the door to the big room. "Crew is sleeping from late night case. Do not disturb." Of course, Jill completely ignored the note, burst into the room, turned on all the lights, and started talking and laughing way too loudly for 7:30 in the morning. She began one of her ridiculous sea stories with, "So, when I was stationed..." Immediately, Joe shot up like a rocket from the couch and walked towards the partition, mumbling under his breath, "Goddamn freaking note on the door." He vigorously fought with the partition, yanking it from the wall and pulling it across the 20-foot-long rail. Jill watched him, and as he was almost done, she said, "I can leave if you want." Completely unwarranted. Joe responded, "That's what the freaking door is for. Close the partition and lay back down." No one said a word, but I think everyone gained a little more respect for Joe that day. Story 12. Back in high school, there was this kid, Brian, who always seemed to attract the attention of bullies. He was a quiet guy, often sitting alone, resembling Anton Chigurh, or Private Pyle, with a blank expression and a distant stare that suggested he wasn't fully present. One day, a couple of bullies were up in Brian's face, taunting him. He just sat there, unresponsive, staring straight ahead. One of the bullies inched closer, and without warning, Brian decked him hard in the face. The bully hit the floor, speechless, blood streaming from his nose. Brian then calmly stood up, still expressionless, packed his things, and walked himself to the principal's office as if nothing had happened. It was one of the most brutal and surreal things I'd ever seen, like a scene straight out of a movie. Brian's stone-cold behavior earned him a grudging respect that day. Story 13. Before the pandemic, I worked with a talented, super nice manager named James. He was a total professional and excellent with customers. Physically, James looked like he could easily be a bouncer, but he was an absolute teddy bear of a human being. No matter what changes came down from the top of the company or how business was going, he soldiered on as a beacon of positivity. He never got visibly mad or upset. He was pure Teflon to bad news. One day, I got a call from the janitorial service we contracted with for deeper cleaning at our facility. They asked me to confirm that we had 2-day shifts and 1 overnight shift cleaning our building. This was puzzling since we only ever had 1-day cleaning shift and 1 overnight cleaning shift. I was sure of this because I regularly reviewed their work and submitted feedback to the contracted company. But they kept insisting that there was a 2nd-day shift that I was somehow missing. Frustrated, I put them on hold and informed James. In an instant, he changed. Gone was the smiling, unflappable James, replaced by a stone-faced mountain of a man. He asked for the phone, went into his office, and I watched through the window as he became increasingly agitated. Eventually, he was outright yelling. The truth came out. We had been charged for a 2nd daytime janitorial shift that we never had. Watching James transform from a teddy bear to a grizzly bear in 3 minutes was startling. After the call, James was able to move past it and return to his usual self, but during that call, he was incensed. The fact that we were being billed for services we didn't receive had pushed him over the edge. It was a side of him I hadn't seen before, and it made me respect him even more for how he handled the situation and then returned to his normal, calm demeanor. Story 14. This isn't my story, but my dad's. Growing up, his best friend Leaf was a quiet, shy guy, a bit socially awkward. In school, he wasn't physically bullied, but one kid teased him constantly. This was in the late 50s or early 60s, so kids were expected to tough it out. My dad often confronted the bully on Leaf's behalf. One day, a girl ran up to my dad saying that Leaf and the bully were fighting. My dad rushed to intervene, expecting to save Leaf. Instead, he found the bully flat on his back, with Leaf sitting on his chest, holding him by the ears and smashing his head into the pavement repeatedly. My dad tackled Leaf and wrestled him to the ground, shouting, "What are you doing?" He later described it to me as seeing nothing behind Leaf's eyes, like he could see the back of his skull through them. Luckily, they were kids, so the damage was serious, but limited. The bully ended up with stitches and a concussion, and Leaf had to talk to the school psychologist. My dad and Leaf remained best friends, and when I met Leaf as an adult, he was still quiet, but less shy and awkward.